everyone. The interesting thing, and I think it's evidence of a very intelligent planning of the program, is that all panels partly overlap and touches. So this one is about geopolitics and trade. When I was asked to replace somebody a couple of, I think last week, when I saw the title, I thought, oh, that's going to be about security. Then I started the World Common and said, oh no, it's about climate change. Well, it's about what you'll see, the reality of geopolitics and how it affects the sort of trade agreements that are developing. Some lawyers would say they're not correct legally. They don't respect the rules. Others, more pragmatic, will say they respond to a need because they're sectorial. You know, I work in the WTO. Now, the big place where there's a lot of activity on substance are what we call the JSI, the Joint Statement Initiatives, which again, formally, legally, are bizarre because not all members are involved, but you do have 100, 120 countries who really want to work about issues. So today we have very special experts that will talk about those new sort of agreement, new content caused by geopolitics in different areas and different sectors. Meredith, who used to be teaching also in New Zealand. Okay. And you were vice dean at Buffalo. Still am. Okay. There's Christian Delev from Cambridge. There's, please come, you can come. I call you all the time busy, but it's not the right name. Olabisi Akinkugbe from Dalhousie, Victor Crochet, and his co-author is missing. And they will all...
He is missing.
All speak about these different sort of new agreements, and depending on your perspective, whether they're correct or not, or legal or not, they certainly respond to geopolitics. So I thought we would start from the broader to more specific. They will all say a few words for 5 minutes or so, and then comment on each other, and then we'll go back to you for a big half hour of questions. Meredith.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. So thank you, Gabrielle, for bringing up JSIs, because that feeds nicely into my talk. I'm going to take us sort of a step back from the JSIs to look at how should we conceptualize the idea of having plurilateral agreements within the WTO. And this is research that I've been working on for a while with different strands of it at different times. And what I want to start with today is so the topic of this, the title of this talk, which isn't on the slide, is Omnilateralism and its Discontents, Reconceptualizing the Multilateral Trading System. And so my thesis for today is that the way the efforts to replicate the Uruguay round, the idea of a single undertaking, the notion that we have to have consensus about absolutely everything, to me suggests that the WTO has gotten stuck in the sense that it is that the ideal or the expectation is one of omnilateralism, that actually everyone has to agree to everything. Whereas multi means many. Multi does not mean all, right? So all is omni and multi is many. Of course, I accept and I would say that the WTO is a multilateral organization, meaning that it was formed by fewer than all the countries in the world, right? But many organizations would be deemed multilateral. They don't necessarily operate with everyone having to agree to everything to get anything done. I think we all agree that, or many would agree at least, that consensus has posed an issue for the WTO, and that's the problem. But I guess the reason I want to look at this issue is to suggest that rather than viewing something less than all as being lesser or settling or not as good, we should I would argue that we should reconceptualize what multilateral trading systems should mean. And in fact, what it has meant historically. So historically in the GATT, we had examples of the codes. For instance, the codes were concluded under the auspices of the multilateral trade negotiations. You find those documents under the code MTN. They weren't PTN, they weren't MTN asterisk asterisk, not everyone is participating, right? That was just, those were some of the results of the rounds and there wasn't much to do about it. If you look back at the sort of leading texts of the time, Kenneth Dan's book, John Jackson's book, Andreas Lowenfeld's book, the word plurilateral does not appear in those books. They talk about issues with the codes, things about conflicting dispute settlement provisions, some concerns about overlaps in that respect. But at the time, the fact that not everyone was agreeing to everything was not seen as problematic. So I think that the Uruguay round was a unicorn. There was this opportunity for the big powers to sort of hold smaller countries, developing countries hostage and say, hey, you've got to agree to this whole package or you lose us because we're leaving the GATT and you can't join us unless you agree to everything. Okay, that was a moment in time. To think that that can be replicated now, it obviously can't be, right? Here we are on year 22 of the not yet willing to be completely dead Doha round. And I think to me, it's helpful to realize that historically, trade agreements were formed, not everyone agreed to everything. And in fact, even in the Uruguay round, even in the creation of the WTO, there are so many provisions that don't require everyone to do the same thing, right? We have a lot of special and differential treatment. We still have an LDC waiver for TRIPS. Is it so different? For example, if we had formed TRIPS and not required LDCs to join, rather than saying, oh, LDCs had to sign on to the whole package, so they're part of TRIPS, but yet they don't have to comply with it, and now we're on year 30 plus. So that's sort of where I'll leave it. That's kind of the framework in which I'm thinking about JSIs and how should we think about that.
You had used, Meredith, in your presentation, a term that I didn't know. You call them omnilateralism.
Yeah,
omnilateralism. But I thought it was an interesting something between universal and multilateral. And indeed, the WTO DG talks about a new multilateral system. And I would add, before I go to Christian, that maybe it's because we, as lawyers, we tend to look at things in a rather static way. And GSI in these imperfect other sort of agreements, if you look at them in a dynamic perspective, they could change and become more broader, more stable and all that. And maybe it goes with digitalization where everything changed faster. I don't know, I'm throwing a question or a comment. Christian, I learned also from your comments, we'll talk about NTAI. So when I saw that, I said, what's this? So the NTAI are the non-liberalizing international trade agreement and initiatives. Christian.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming here. So to set the scene, let's look at something that's popping up quite a lot on the news lately, which is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. And when we hear about this, it seems to have certain ambitions: supply chains, labor, trying to affect critical minerals as well. But when we look at all in practice, it has one quirk to it. That it liberalizes no trade, no tariffs at all, no going nowhere near standards as well, or technical barriers trade. And it seems unusual in a sense. And we hear different rhetorics around that. So, for instance, Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai have described this as being a new approach, a model for the rest of the world. But then, of course, there's some other perhaps crustier approaches to it, which say that essentially it doesn't really promise too much, these types of initiatives, because you don't have the carrot to let any of your trade partners in. What my paper and presentation today will look at instead is trying to actually criticize both of these angles. To say that that IPEF itself is not just not novel in any sense, but also that it's not also toothless. We're seeing a lot more of these non-liberalizing trade agreements initiatives popping up all around. Think, for instance, of all the agreements that got concluded following the Brexit process. How we saw a lot of these rollover agreements simply copy-pasting the model that used to exist in the past. We're seeing it even more nowadays. If we look at, for instance, the EU-US Trade and Tech Council in its initial stage, it didn't actually promise to do that much, but nowadays it's again having some more significance. So first of all, it's important to see how these types of arrangements operate within our common assumptions about the international trade system. And it's usually the three claims we sometimes will hear. One is that the trade law, it's there to enhance wealth. Another approach is, of course, that it's there to contribute to development. And of course, there's the always underlying line that trade liberalization is there to also contribute to national security preservation, both at preventing it from starting, but also managing it after the conflict has started at some point, which we've seen sometimes. So how do these entes fare here? Well, if you look at, for instance, at the level of trade liberalization, let's look at actually quite a lot of these rollover agreements that happened following Brexit. Many of them were able to stabilize a lot of the expectations that existed in the past. And even the ones that rolled back when it came to mutual recognition, for instance, the UK-Switzerland agreement is a good example of it, have now established a setting for more liberalization to occur later. So there's an element of recalibration we can see. Not all of them do this, and many of them will not contribute in that way. But of course, we don't always need more and more liberalization within our system. Sometimes we need to stick with the current model. Then when we look at the idea of development, well, of course, we've seen a lot of these entes, and a hybrid example being USMCA, where there's been a lot of power push, where there's been a lot of efforts to try and use a divide and conquer strategy in the early stages by the Trump administration and force the hand of Mexico in many different respects. But there's still many principles that occur, especially within South-South agreements, such as variable geometry, that allow us, as Professor Gaffey has written about, for instance, to actually just slow down the progress of trade liberalization, to keep it to some extent, to maintain our current commitments whilst we achieve other objectives outside of just welfare for welfare's sake, broadening the pies. And then, of course, we get to that very interesting element of national security. And these agreements do very well clash with that view. But that's only if we assume that we get to trade security preservation only when two states are heavily integrated, a bit like the McDonald's effect we sometimes hear about. But actually, if you look at the game theory research here, it says that if you conclude an agreement with a third state, that puts pressure on any of your potential opponents, using their geo-economic force towards you. And we've seen such initiatives coming up now, such as the US-Taiwan Trade Initiative and all these types of agreements. So I'll park here and we'll talk about the actual effects of these agreements and what functions we seek to strive with them later on. Thanks so much.
So your main point being, if I understood correctly, that trade liberalization may not be the only benefit coming out of an agreement. When you come again, you may talk about other benefits. And similar to what you said, you have seen all these new awkward trade data agreement between Japan, US, and between Chile, Singapore, I think, New Zealand, and awkward partners and you don't know exactly where they fit. But in the next round, I hope you'll tell me whether they're useful or not. Some governments think they are. Victor, in the same vein of these new agreements, many talk about sectorial agreements entering the climate change. Some even talk we had, some people even suggested that it's the only way to go forward because sectors, areas are so different from one another, then having horizontal sort of rules alone would not suffice. So please, you will discuss, I think, mineral agreements.
Yes. I'm slightly old school, so I have slides to assist me and keep you entertained with nice pictures as I speak. So yeah, I'll divide my presentation in two parts, and now I'll focus more on the policy aspect. And then when we get to speak again, I'll turn more to the legal questions that arise with raw materials. So the first question you may ask is, what are critical minerals? In a sense, they are the oil of the 21st century. While during most of the 20th century, our economies were running on oil, now we need critical minerals for green technologies. So you can think of the minerals that go into car batteries, those that go into windmills, those that go into semiconductors. And they're quite different from oil in several respects. The first one is that oil was quite abundant. We didn't really have a situation of shortage. While with critical minerals for the foreseeable future, we have demand that's growing much faster than what we can extract from the ground if we can ever extract enough to meet the demand we have. Another difference is that oil was a single input, while critical minerals, there's many of them, and they are spread all across the world, but most minerals are only found in a few locations. So if we think about lithium for car batteries, it's mostly found here in Chile and maybe in Australia. If we think of cobalt, it's mostly found in the Congo. And while supplies is distributed in different places, at the moment, processing of these minerals, because you can't just use lithium and put it in a car battery, processing is mostly conducted in China. So this situation is creating what I call a web of interdependencies, where no single country has all the mineral it needs for its industry, and some countries even don't have any really. And this has led governments to develop critical mineral strategies as what I call the upstream side of their new green industrial policies. And I've grouped these strategies into two main groups. The first one I've called proactive strategies, and those are strategies enacted by government that need some minerals from other countries in order to secure foreign resources and control over these resources. So we can think about China, for example, using the Belt and Road Initiative, using instructing state-owned enterprises and subsidizing this enterprise to go and mine abroad and then export to China. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, we have what I call defensive strategies. And those are used by resource-rich countries in order to keep control over their minerals, but also reap the benefits of their own natural wealth. So here, I think everybody's heard about Indonesia's export ban on nickel ore, which was sued by the EU at the WTO in order to create downstream value-added industries. And from a policy point of view, these two different strategies are leading to two main challenges. The first one is between resource-rich countries and advanced economies that need minerals. Because what we see is countries like the EU or Japan or China, which need minerals, and on the other hand, resource-rich countries that don't want to just extract and export minerals, but want to finally get the benefits of their natural wealth, quite similar to the discourse we had in the 1970s following the independence of many former colonies. The second tension we see is between advanced economies themselves, because we see China and the EU or the US competing for access for the same minerals, right? We see Africa being divided, or like lots of countries fighting over resources in the Congo. We see the same in Indonesia between the EU and China fighting for nickel reserves there. And that's creating a second source of tension because we don't have enough minerals. And then this is leading to two main risks. The first one, I think, is increasing beggar thy neighbor policy, not on the market access side, like we had during most of the 20th century, but here on the supply side. And the second risk is a more security related, and particularly in a geopolitical context, because this web of interdependency that I was describing earlier can very much be weaponized by the countries that have either a dominant position in the mining or in the processing. And we saw this very clearly last week with China announcing an export licensing regime on 2 minerals which are necessary to make semiconductors. So yeah, I'll leave it here for setting up the big picture, and I'll turn back to the legal question later. Thank you, Gabrielle.
So as you can see, my idea was that for the first presentation, people would explain a bit the factual description of those, and then afterwards we'll talk about whether it fits in the WTO, whether governments pretend it does. And just to add to your announcement this morning, I read that China put forward a proposal for supply chain in critical areas. So how does these things fit in the big picture? And we'll end with Bisi and your presentation on the same reality in Africa in particular, or maybe in, with the new free trade agreement across the continent.
So thank you.
Fit?
Okay, thanks, Gabrielle, and it's nice to be on the panel with you all. Let me start by reading captions from 2 or maybe 3 different news reports. This one is titled, US lawmakers ask White House to punish South Africa for supporting Russia. Date June 12. What did South Africa do? Well, South Africa is supposedly sovereign entity, I believe, exercised that power with its fellow countries in Africa to visit Russia. That was perceived by the US, particularly its lawmakers, as offensive, and therefore this bipartisan group, I'm quoting, of American lawmakers has asked Biden administration to punish South Africa for what it sees as a country's support of Russia's war in Ukraine by moving a major trade conference scheduled to be held in South Africa this year to another country. Source, the New York Times. Here is the South African government's website. The heading, Premier Alan Wind leads delegation to US to promote Western Cape as a trade investment destination of choice. This was just in June. The last one is this one. Quote, from bilaterals.org, and it's been reported in many newspapers, South Africa government officials head to the US to save AGOA trade deal, right? So the threat is real. A South African delegation will embark on a charm offensive in the US this week, aiming to defuse tensions with the African nation's second biggest trading partner. That's the significance over foreign policy and retain its preferential access to market access, to American access. So I thought to start with that because, discussions about geopolitics often take on a very huge dimension, and I think you guys have done well to bring it into a very close context. And so I'll keep my own remarks within that. And all I want to say is within the context of 2 points, then I'll speak to them. Number one is, I like that you used, Africa is divided. Actually, just added it. Divide and conquer is a strategy that's worked and I think continues to work. And we can talk about it in the context of the AfCFTA and what the US and Kenya tried to do in the context of an FTA that they tried to complete. But the first point I'm trying to make is that despite what one might consider as the progressive trade landscape in the African continent right now, Africa remains caught amidst a very serious geopolitical tension at the international and regional level. And I think the quote I gave really exemplifies how a particular powerful state can weaponize its own agenda to really punish a state that has no sovereign entity. I can speak more to that in a short while. The second point I want to put on the table is that the hypocritical position of the powerful Western states, US, many European Union countries, and including China in this context, as well as the geopolitical contentions, have a drowning effect on Africa's trade agenda. It threatens to upend it in many ways than one. And so for many who are not familiar with that continent, there's a lot that's gone on in the past maybe 6 to 7 years in terms of trying to articulate its one position, negotiation ground to push back on this powerful ways in which certain Western countries have really, to use your word again, divided the countries' trade patterns and abilities. So the historical narrative at this international level that African continent is a terrain of geopolitical and economic struggle among powerful Western states. When it comes to trade, has acquired a different level of complexity in the past 3 decades or so. Those complexities are not necessarily ones that will characterize as legacies of colonialism. They're accentuated by things like the pandemic. They're accentuated by things like the real war that's going on in Ukraine and Russia, not the US-China wannabe trade war that never happened, that we were made to believe could be one. So the complexity of the positionality of African states in geopolitical trade dynamics takes on a new dimension with the rise of China, with the rise of India, with the rise of Brazil, erstwhile South-South countries, but exercising, as James said this morning, the same disciplinary techniques once it comes to these kinds of relationships. And so although its economic investment does not match that of China, if you think about Russia, you want to think about the role the Wagner Group is playing on the continent. And so here, I'm moving to security, the actual protected people, not the technical one which you've described. It's there then, the continent, if you're thinking about the role in Libya, Sahel, Sudan, Central African Republic, Mozambique, and how they protect the mining of gold that goes out of these regions, out of the country, so out of the continent. So in this first beat, what I'm trying to put on the table is if we need to think about the geopolitical uniqueness that African states are dealing with today, with every sense of what it means historically, but how today's unique, complex situations, right, puts that on a different stage. The negotiation of the AGOA rounds for 2025 will happen. We don't know what it will be like. There's the Belt and Road Initiative that's been written about a lot. There's India doing its own thing on the continent. But there's also just the sheer relationship of how African states see themselves vis-a-vis these kinds of other partners that they deal with. The second thing, and then I'll end on this round, is to then put it that in my second round, I'll go to the AFCFT and ask more questions about how this plays out on the continent. Thanks.
But we had decided, because it was so interesting, that the second round you would start and continue your presentation, because I find it fascinating, all these sort of very unique, as you say, factual situation, tensions, so many natural resources there, but at the same time, the free trade continental agreement is extremely traditional. And the dispute settlement system, for instance, is a copy of the DSU. So how do you interpret and read together these different reality, uniqueness that you use twice, and some traditional sort of approach in the context of sustainability, as you suggested?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And again, I wrote that email and I was saying to Meredith that, I don't think I even want to speak to sustainability, because I think the first set of reflections put a lot on the table if we're looking at the architecture of the AFCFTA, right, as it were. You've mentioned it. One can say, okay, we get critical. The dispute settlement regime of the AFCFTA trade, it's a copy and paste of the WTO. Well, we can put that aside. But I think if you get more granular, it gets even more interesting, right? And there are very many points we can make out of this kind of relationship, to go back to that word, punish, and how it disciplines or makes a country behave. It's more or less saying fall in line, or else we'll make you, cripple one more time, right? Which I think is, tells us, well, this region has nothing to give, right? Other than what we tell them. If you want to use the much more scholarly, the epistemes of knowledge production in terms of trade and the practices that happen in the sub-regional level, right? It's often not accounted for in this kind of debates. And so the over focus on the geopolitical dynamics and what it means, for example, when we think about the articulation of the various trade strategy documents that emerge out of Europe vis-a-vis the African country, right? EU's trade strategy for Africa. Switzerland has one particular different one. You think about them and you ask what they mean on a whole. It means that there's, that one point, there's nothing coming out of this region that they can see as a way the region actually trades they can use.
Do they see the same thing? And could Africa play them against each other or use them better?
I would like to say yes, but when you talk about power and the flow of capital, that becomes very academic at the end of the day. A lot of what still happens under that whole dynamic of what James describes as racialization in one context, but we can use about capitalism as a whole. And so the pushback that we've seen, let me use Tanzania as an example, some years ago tried to push back against the dynamics of investment and all that is coming on. But then there was a change of government and all of those were rolled back. They became the country asking for investment.
South Africa, they push back on investment, they're pushing hard.
But they're the ones going to beg the US, right? So the point I'm trying to make is we are caught, and I think I'll see it. This is the challenge, right? Nobody is asking the powerful Western states and China to step back. At a much more interesting level, there's a national and regional dimension at which you can ask questions of what has failed to be done at those levels. But we cannot also so easily dispense the continuities, right, of power and how they are constantly mutilating, right, mutating, right, to really discipline these countries today. And I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Victor, so where does it fit? Those,
I should have one more slide, so if I can, my slides back. Thanks.
Where does it fit in the traditional multilateral trade system in WTO? Does it matter if it fits or doesn't fit in what exists?
Well, I think I'll use a case study to address that question. And because I'm from Europe, it's easier for me to do that. And Weihuan was supposed to be there, was going to look at China, but we can discuss China in the question if you want. But I think we can very much see, and something that I've observed, is that WTO rules are very oriented towards market access, right? They're not very focused towards the supply side of things. But this, the green industrial revolution, let's call it like that, is kind of changing the focus where we really need supplies. And I think that's where the WTO fits in the picture, but is also lacking in some respects. And if we look at the EU as an example, the EU is perhaps one of the worst regions when it comes to having minerals for the green transition, because we don't have much and we don't like mining because it's bad for the environment. So we don't really want it to happen in Europe. So we really need minerals from abroad. And what we saw over the last 10 years, it's the EU first really making use of the one rule in the WTO about access to supplies from abroad, which is Article 11 of the GATT, right? So we've seen the EU suing China over the export restrictions on raw minerals, and recently suing Indonesia and winning a WTO panel on this. But it leaves lots of loopholes, right? So what we've seen the EU doing is pushing for extra rules on export restrictions. And we see it first in the process of WTO accession, where the EU is one of the first to push for banning export taxes, which are allowed under Article 11. But we've seen the EU also really changing the focus of its free trade agreement to something that was very much about market access to know something that's about access to supplies. And we've seen the EU in this agreement usually asking for a ban on export taxes, but now also devising entire chapters on access to raw materials in its FTA with trading partners. So the EU has chapters on this with Chile, with now they're trying to have the same with Indonesia and Australia, with Kazakhstan, with Ukraine, where they kind of try to ban all measures that could allow what I call the defensive strategy. So the strategies that countries could use to keep their raw materials. So we see, for example, we see them preventing discriminatory sales by state-owned enterprise to make sure that they can't just sell domestically and not export. We see them preventing dual pricing schemes, so schemes where a country would say, okay, you have to sell real materials cheaper domestically than for export, thereby giving an advantage to the domestic companies. And then we see the EU using trade defense tools and imposing higher trade defense duties when a country has in place export restrictions on raw materials. But then the EU is also focusing on investment strategy. And what's quite interesting is that in the same free trade agreement, the EU is really pushing for market access for its investors in exploration and mining, and then introducing, the more usual bilateral investment treaty guarantee against expropriation for its mining companies. And then maybe the final point, which links to what Christian was talking about, is really this more collaborative aspects. We've seen the EU going on a charm offensive and signing a lot of memorandum of understanding on critical mineral partnership with Kazakhstan, with Ukraine, with Namibia. I don't have the entire list, but a lot of them, and those are they're not trade treaties in the usual sense. They mostly provide for collaboration on value chain integration, on cross-border financing, where the EU says, all right, if you promise to export your raw materials back to Europe, we will provide you cross-border financing and develop mines in your countries. And we'll provide infrastructure a bit similarly to what China does under the Belt and Road Initiative, which will link these countries to the EU. So I think it's quite an interesting shift in international economic law, which was really focused mainly on market access and is now really also looking more and more at the supply side of things.
But could it be just a step towards something else? Is it very different from what has happened for years where the strong countries basically negotiate what they want based on their needs?
Well, I think what we can see is that the EU first brought a lot of these issues to the WTO in the early 2000s, where the EU tried to have an international agreement on export taxes, and then came back to these issues because it couldn't get traction in the WTO into free trade agreement or in the process of WTO accession. And I think the EU then very much would like to internationalize all these disciplines at a broader level.
It's a bit similar to what's happening in labor standards.
Exactly, yeah.
Not able to do it multilaterally, so they do it in regional trade agreement and then build up.
But then I think what we see is a lot of pushback with these issues being hot topics, for example, in the negotiation with Indonesia, or even with Chile, where Chile did not want to agree to all the disciplines of the EU, and so agreed to it, but with some carve out. So yeah, we'll see how that turns out.
I hope somebody will ask you whether all these agreements are WTO consistent, but I won't. People may think I'm not very much a lawyer, and a few hours ago I said we need economists and engineer, and now I'm not sure compatibility is an issue. Christian, the agreements we're talking about are also new in a sense, because they have certain goals that are trade related, but their immediate goal is not liberalization. Are they good for both sides?
Well, I think to draw on what I said last time, it's important to think of them not as being by default good, by default bad. We're rather dealing with this, the question of design. How do you design the agreement itself? To what end? And that's also where we see a lot of their functions coming into play. So in the paper itself, I identified 3 large groups of functions. The first one relates to stabilization of expectations. That stabilization of expectations when it comes to both your domestic producers, but also when it comes to foreign exporters. A good example to see where we've encountered this is with the Brexit process and with the trade and cooperation agreement ultimately got signed. If anyone remembers the discussions in the UK at that time, it was horrible. We did not really understand where there was going to be an agreement in the first place until about 5 days or days before deadline, where there would be no such rules, until WTO law would be enforced. So in these cases, they served as a second worst alternative. In that way, they managed to affect a lot of the uncertainty that existed around the time. That's when it comes to your exporters. And when it comes to your simply just looking at domestic producers, it's because very often states will have a lot of different domestic actors trying to ensure greater and greater protections. And these agreements, of course, can either maintain what existed in the past, simply confirm we're not moving anywhere further from that, or of course, we always have the risk that there's going to be a move towards protectionism. So we need to be aware of all these different dimensions when it comes to that idea of stabilization. Stabilization doesn't necessarily need to be a good thing or a bad thing. It's concept dependent. Second one is these agreements may well create the environment for political and regulatory cooperation to emerge. When it comes to this, very often when we think about trade agreements, we always think about the idea of integration, and there's sometimes a tendency to look at it from a very new functionalist perspective. That's what pretty much everyone who discusses EU law does at the start of any type of course. But that's also one of the limitations of it, because the further you get integrated, the more your economies begin to interact with each other, you will have certain fault lines coming up. And this could lead to certain issues appearing later on. So very often these agreements can simply pause the situation and allow for different regimes to be established on top of what existed. There are, of course, risks that come with this, and this can allow for power politics. The USMCA is a good example of just that, as I mentioned earlier on. I can elaborate later as well. But they can also allow for certain amounts of regulatory cooperation to emerge, short of mutual recognition, short of equivalence, short of harmonization. For instance, if you look at the US-Taiwan agreement that we found the text of, we'll notice that actually one of the key elements there is that we always talk about the idea of alignment. We hear the term alignment coming all across there. That the rules there are going to align when it comes to standards, when it comes to technical regulations, SPS measures, etc. But of course, simply aligning doesn't mean you're going to ultimately get to that final level of any type of deeper integration. But still, it allows for the regulatory dialogue to occur in the first place. So it sets the conditions for broader cooperation to emerge, and maybe even creates the institutions for that. The final point I want to raise is perhaps the most controversial one. And I'll mention why it's controversial in a second. It concerns the idea that these agreements can create a first mover's advantage. Trade liberalization can very often take a long period of time to negotiate your schedules, especially when there are very key sectors in play. So what these agreements do? Very often just pause what existed in the past and try and create new disciplines faster. Now, the idea then is that that parties would like to enter, for instance, into agreements with the United States here, because what happens when you set new rules on the table is that likely this is what these states are going to follow later on. The United States, the European Union are very keen on copy-pasting the models that worked in the past. So IPEF, for instance, could well be a way for other states to try and throw in their interest, shape the narrative at the early stage before it starts to develop in the long run. But of course, there are risks with this, and it's whether you can actually reproduce that rule in a broader context. And here's where the idea of legitimacy might be a problem, and the idea of WTO legality. Because, for instance, the IPEF supply chain agreement, a lot of it talks about resilience, but it's really about management. It's about trade management in many respects. Governments have to coordinate with a lot of their industries. This reminds me a lot of what we were seeing in the 70s and the 80s with voluntary export restrictions. And because of that, we have the classic issue of Article 11. So is this going to, again, stop what happened in the past, as we saw, let's say, in the classic Japan semiconductors case, the superfunds cases? Or are we, again, going to risk simply putting WTO off to the side? And again, that's going to have certain issues if you try to multilateralize these ideas, because it's going to lead to conflicts emerging in the regime where you want to put those rules in.
Thank you. Meredith, I really like your omnilateral sort of turn, and it's fast.
Thank you. Yeah, so let me tie this to JSIs a little bit, just to take us on the geopolitical angle. So, as you know from work that you've helped me develop, I've sort of grappled with what should we think about the JSIs and what does this mean for the developing countries that have a legitimate gripe about the failure of the Doha round to conclude, and it's very understandable to not want to let that go. And what I discussed in this SIEL article that Gabrielle helped me develop is that it's a false equivalency or a false comparison to think about omnilateralism versus JSIs, because omnilateralism is not happening, right? It's not. Everyone is not going to agree to everything in some sort of magical Doha round. So what we have had happen pre the JSIs and what continues to happen is the formation of ever more substantive and substantial free trade agreements, right? We have mega regionals, we have WTO plus agreements, and while the action in the GATT in terms of trade negotiations was really in the multilateral forum, because there were no trade agreements between any of the big players, right? EU, US, Japan, Canada, China, none of these had FTAs with each other. So their drive for market access with each other drove those multilateral negotiations, those rounds. That's what brought them to the table. Then when the Doha round faltered, those countries said, gee, we want to get stuff done. So they started some negotiations with each other, some of which completed, some of which didn't. But they realized, gee, we can get some of these things that we want externally. And so to me, the choice that is going on now is for developing countries in particular is, do we want to remain pure and stick with the ideal that we had before, which will, in my view, just continue negotiations outside the WTO, which those countries don't get to have to see what's happening. They don't get to see the negotiations. They don't get to say, hey, could you maybe take that in this direction instead of that direction? They don't get to have any input whatsoever, versus accommodating certain types, I'm not saying open the floodgates, but certain types of negotiations within the WTO, such as the JSIs, where at least you get to see what's going on. And importantly to me, I think the benefits of any such agreements like that should be provided on an MFN basis. Now, that's not as good as having the negotiations turn out the way you want and then having it be on MFN. But at least if you're going to not have to make commitments but receive the benefits, I can see that as a reasonable choice to make. And I'll tie it to James's excellent keynote when he was talking about, well, given everything that's happened in the past, do we really need to think about debt repayment as just debt repayment? Can't we think about the fact that actually there were some harms that occurred in taking on the debt in the first place? I think that the JSIs also provide an opportunity, number one, to get countries that have been negotiating outside back into the WTO in general, in the talks, right? We had the fisheries subsidies agreement, which was multilateral, which is omnilateral, in my view. And maybe that wouldn't have happened if there weren't other talks going on. We don't know. But I think that the JSIs provide an opportunity for countries such as India and South Africa, which have been vocally opposed, to say, okay, well, why don't we talk about some things that you could do for us, and we'll go along with the JSIs. Maybe this puts more food on the buffet table to negotiate over, whereas the multilateral, the mega regional agreements and the agreements happening outside are taking things off the table, right? The things that got the US and India tied up when the Doha round collapsed, the US would want more now. The US is getting those things elsewhere, right? And I think the gulf is greater if you're tying it just to market access. But maybe in terms of offering things on services, offering things like tech transfer, offering other sorts of concessions that developing countries might want, benefits, maybe the JSIs provide some more fodder for negotiations.
Thank you. So I'll go to the room, but allow me to say three things sharing on GSI. First, this idea that GSI is a north-south issue is fundamentally wrong. The first GSI is investment facilitation initiated by 6 developing countries. Second, if you think of the plastic one, they started 14 with good ideas, then it went to the UN, they're 74, and now they are talking about having some sort of agreement. There are legal issues because you're not too sure what these agreements are. But the last point is I follow it up with the e-commerce. It's the most difficult because even amongst the group, they want not to respect MFN because all the others claim that they will give to all members the benefit. It is fascinating to see the energy and the quality of the substance and how people speak and really believe in the system. It reminds me when the WTO started and everybody was believing in the system. So really the 6, now there are I think 9 GSI are, and they're different type. There are those who want to negotiate an agreement, but you have all the environment ones where the public is also invited. And the quality in terms of substantive work that takes place there cannot be ignored. But the difficulty is, what are they exactly? Where do they fit? And and let me conclude on this, the geopolitics and trade. I think geopolitics has always influenced the way trade agreement evolve. It's not different, but now geopolitics are changing. The big countries, it's not only the US and it's not only US and EU. It's more complicated, but don't think that the GSI at the WTO is just rich country. US did not follow the investment facilitation, for instance. And what I like from your last comment, and we'll go to question, is that this recognition that maybe there another way or exploring another way of doing trade-off. And I was asking James when his talk ended, could we trade word for word? I cut out your debt if you give me that market access, or if you give me whatever, money or tariff. Maybe the link, the GSI will open the door to these new sort of trade-off. But let's take a series of questions and then series of answers. So please, Bernard.
Well, really interesting. A question for Victor and for Christian. Christian, the US is really not a new kind of agreement that is, I say this for medium enterprise, medium size enterprise and so on. The question is, this agreement will be discussed in the Article 24 in WTO because of just various exercise, or they are not going to the WTO at all. So the point is, because certainly they are discriminatory, Article 24 and a lot of things that you cannot not follow in this agreement. So where you are going to discuss this kind. And Victor, I fully agree what you said on the mining side. But when you go to the refining side, you have a new word, and 90% of refining of all the minerals you said are being refined in China. And well, why? Because they use a lot of energy and they are really good. And what we are going to do with the rejects of this money? As I said, 90% are rejected. What you're going to do with this? So the geopolitics from minerals is one thing, for refining is another one. So put them together and see what's going to happen. That's very good.
Amy, and then the gentleman. Yes, Amy.
I guess one question for about IPEF. Okay, so there is not, let's say there is unhappiness. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What?
Louder.
Yes. Louder.
Okay, about IPEF, there is, let's say, I wouldn't say it's my corner of the world, Washington. There's not, you wouldn't say that there's unanimous enthusiasm for IPEF. The same parties who you could say the administration wants to appease by not doing a classic trade agreement are not endorsing IPEF either. Okay, they're not, those people are not going to endorse IPEF either.
But you have a complicated political.
But, okay, so on the other hand, Okay, so U.S. business community is saying, you know, where's the beef? No, and they're serious. It's kind of like when you're going out on a shopping expedition to buy something complicated like a suit. You warm up by buying a pair of socks. And so, you know, is like that the pair of socks? Is it a warm up to something real? Or is it, you know, is that where it stops? And I think the business community is afraid that that's where it stops.
But if it stops there, is
But
it necessarily bad?
Getting regulators in the same room is always useful. And it's particularly useful where they're regulating, let's say the regulation area is one that's sort of high touch, and involves lots of credibility. Like, for instance, financial regulation, chemical regulation, where credibility matters. So, but you know, that's nice. Maybe it'll develop into something. But the thing is, there are some sectors that don't benefit. For instance, the U.S. agriculture communities really very unhappy with the situation because, like other countries like Brazil, farmers in the U.S. grow much more than people in the U.S. can eat. They care deeply about exports, which affect their the survivability of a farmer, their ability to go on farming. And they care about market access abroad. Market access abroad is under threat. There are increasing threats from SBS and other things and tariffs. So they really care about the fact that they're getting MICA instead of getting something real. So at least what they would say is real.
Okay, so some are unhappy.
Well, it's not a recipe for unhappiness. Maybe it's a way station for something, but it's not something to stop it. Okay, finally, okay, Meredith's point about, well, wouldn't it be great if, let's say, you could go to India and South Africa and say, you raise these, you know, systematic legal objections to all JSIs. Okay, how much do you want? What do you want us to pay you? Do you want, you know, for instance, India's food security proposal? You know, do you want that? Do you want something else? You know, people like trade negotiators understand paying people off to get a deal. How did the Uruguay round happen?
Yeah, but there's trade-offs within the system.
But this, the GSI
and
the whole
outside the
concept is so heterodox. How if you're going to do this as a sort of payday exercise, who do you pay? Where once you start saying you're going to pay to get where you want, where does it stop?
Thank you. Marcus and the gentleman, well, the gentleman head first and then Marcus.
My question pertains to, you mentioned energy and long-term chapter in the proposals. So there are certain elements in those proposals which I believe completely neglect WTO disciplines, particularly WTO disciplines on state-owned enterprises. So there are provisions in EU ERM proposals which clearly state that parties cannot maintain import-export. While if you look at Article 17 of GATT, it allows for a framework where parties can designate entities with special privileges when it comes to import-export matters. On the contrary, you have transparency obligations which operate when parties have to justify these import-export monopolies that are operating. Now, in a lot of states, including India, energy security forms a very important element of how policy operates in these areas. And India designates import-export. Like these are both sides of the issue. Now, when such obligations come in, it completely, I believe, neglects Article 17 of the WTO. On the other hand, if you look at ERM proposals, they also create very convenient carve-outs for public service obligations, universal service obligations, and SGEIs, which are, although there might be counterparts in other policy regimes, but which are very EU specific. It kind of creates a very different regime when it comes to trade in critical minerals and energy raw materials per se.
Thank you. Marcus? I'll go on the other side. We have 25 minutes more. No worries. Marcus?
So thanks. Fascinating panel, and not because very, very kind. But the reason I find it fascinating is it links in quite a bit with the great project on the yes, I think I've heard it at various times. There's a couple of questions. One, when you use the term weaponized trade, some of you have, right? What do you actually mean by that? Right? So we have a very robust definition. But I'd like to know what you have, what you're doing. The second one is broader and goes more towards the other role we have in the teaching role. Because every single presentation that I've heard changes the way that I think we need as lawyers need to think about how we teach and how we think about grade, right? So what that's very funded. I've had other projects where I was trying to lay out how international trade agreements or trade arrangements might be thought about, right? So, so my question, I guess, is how do we equip future trade lawyers with the tools? And what are those tools in their life? To think about these things beyond the narrow confines of sort of the black letter lawyer, and I'm German, trust me, we look beyond the narrow confines of black letter law. And so two questions.
Yeah, I'll take two more questions, then I'll go back to the panel, and then we'll take. So I mentioned Pinar and the gentleman here.
My name is Olabisi, and I thought that the illustration on South Africa simply affirms that big powers will pursue their interests as they always have. The way that interests interact with traders, I guess, is something which you take for granted. But I thought what would be a more interesting aspect to look at is what should be a coherent African response. For example, would there be unity in numbers if African countries speak with one voice? Should the African Union Commission be given more powers to negotiate, to pursue African interests, and so on? So, just to, sort of try to probe you a bit more this year of this, because you left it all hanging. You illustrated the problem, but not really where would we see some elements of a solution emerging. So just to, see what your response would be to, what steps, what the solutions, what would Africans do?
So Pinar, and then we go to the panel, and I return to the floor.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. I was impressed, like the audience, about the performance and all the topics which were covered. I would have three very small questions for three speakers. First, for Victor. The issue with rare earths, raw materials, is very important. And you said at the beginning of your presentation how it is important for all of us. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have heard the WTO talking a lot about the common goods. So isn't there a prospect of creating these, common goods out of raw materials? Of course, I understand you had a special approach towards the European Union, but I would argue that since this is critical to all of us, instead of just focusing on one country or group of countries to try to regulate this field, perhaps we need a multilateral global approach to make it sure that this is going to be a common good that we can all benefit from. I think this is crucial. The second thing I would like to ask you very briefly, though. Now, you have in the European Union a very important investment screening mechanism. I know you're a trade lawyer, but I'm sure you have looked at it. So when the European Union is trying to regulate the market, like if mining is so important, would they put any brakes on European companies whenever they are investing abroad in relation to mining? In countries like China, would this investment screening, outbound investment screening, also applicable to rare earths in third countries? For Meredith, I mean, I love your analysis of JSI. We always said that regional trade agreements are laboratories for multilateral trading system. Now, do you really take the view that the JSIs could actually be the new laboratory for the WTO agreements? I will give just one example. For instance, Turkey, my country, has participated in the JSI for investment facilitation for a long time, but they withdrew at the last moment. And there are certain other developing countries I've heard they withdrew at the last moment as well. So what is it that the JSI proposals cannot really meet the expectations of developing countries? So if they cannot meet the expectations of developing countries, can they really be a laboratory for regional trade agreements or the other type of concerns that we may have? And for BC, I'm very much impressed by Africa. I just quote a recent article which appeared in Bloomberg on the 5th of July. It says India increases Africa landing in race to counter China. You yourself said that there is this increasing competition between China and India. Now, within the geopolitics and trade, how do you see these two major, emerging economies, but they are super powerful? What do you learn as African countries when you are dealing with two different cultures, actually, but they are aiming at the same thing? What are the lessons to be learned from these two countries? Thank you.
So, BZ, why don't you start?
Okay.
And
All right.
then we just go.
Okay, sounds good. So, I mean, to start with Pia's question, last question. So on the one hand, I don't think I will subscribe to distinguishing between India, China, Brazil, or any other, emerging one in terms of how they do what they do. Right? The resources are there; they are there for that. As far as we know, none of them is interfering in the political governance of the states. Therefore, the investments coming. The challenge, though, is what African states can do to them, right? I'm mindful of, we're talking about India, but we're talking about Africa. So, right, the continent of over of many countries, and we're thinking about them relative to a country, right? That in itself is problematic as a way to think about relationships that go on. And so to particularize it, for example, if we think about Nigeria, where I've come from, investments by India in Nigeria go back way many years. They own a lot of, steel manufacturing corporations in Lagos. And so to come to what might be the solution for different states to maybe escalate at BAU level to think about how to deal with this. And I think it then bleeds into your question. There's definitely need to also put our house in order, right? I don't know that coherence is the word. If we can achieve something that balances the interests of various African states in terms of least developed, landlocked, and those that are developing, that would be fantastic. But the politics of the region in itself hasn't really allowed that to happen. And that's where I'm not able to get to, because there's a regional, national dimension to the presentation I made that really brings it all together. And so the response, the African Union has to find its feet. This is not for the AFCFTA office, in my view, to do. I'm beginning to respond to you now while I'm leaving that. The African Union still remains the umbrella body, right, that brings all the heads of states together, the most powerful organ that of the AU. And so I think, you know more about this. You were involved in the drafting and preparation of these documents. You are an economist, so I should say it to the room, which is interesting to be speaking to an economist about this. But I do think the design of how as an outsider, the design of how the AFCFTA's operation has played out so far is problematic for us as a region. And I think that's where you see a number of the divide and conquer strategies beginning to play out, because there's power tussle between the African Union and the AFCFTA about who should do what and where what should sit. And so in the regional context, to come back to your word, if coherence is ever a thing we can achieve in that context, that would be great. But while you were asking me the question, I spoke to the sub-regional, communities. There's a wealth of practice in there that I think can be looked at in terms of how we deal as regions, right, with issues. And so I want, coherent African response, yes, but I'm also careful to note that there's the challenge of how to do that If we had coherence, maybe African Union would be the one issuing a statement to the US, right? Really calling them out for this kind of move to easily want our biggest industrialized country. Just some thoughts on Marcus's question, and then I can leave it. How do we teach international economic law differently? Is how I've noted it in here. I think it's a great question, and I think it's one which in a conference like SIEL we do need to talk about a lot. So let me give a personal example instead of one that is abstract. I use Peter's book for my students, and why do I like it? You're welcome. Why do I like it? I like the way he started, right? This hasn't started with the traditional jump into WTO, sustainable development, right? There's a discussion about these various ideas that are not classic trade-centric issues, but are important to understanding the architecture, right, that we form in. So as a Global South scholar who teaches in a global North university, and I think this probably applies to everybody, there's a task of teaching the students to understand what the rules are, right? You have to engage with the doctrine for what it is. So we can't start off being critical from day one of the regime because they don't know it. But there's a genuine need to, number one, supplement some of these standard textbooks with materials. And it is no longer good to say the materials are not available. No, they're actually all now more available, including as James' book, which we tweeted on SIEL today. So if you're on Twitter, go there, just download it. It's free. So there are resources that are out there that we must use to supplement very good traditional textbooks, right? That have done very well. That's number one. Number two is, think about guest speakers you can bring to your class, right? This world, you don't have to pay their flight. Zoom lecture, 1 hour. It really brings a different idea, right, to the students about how regions practice in different ways. And I think we can talk about the theoretical approaches that scholars bring to it as well. And that's one thing I do, right? Geraldo, I've quoted your tweet to my students. No, but that's how real it gets. So because he did a nice thread that I thought, why not? And I gave it to them, right? So I think, that conversation is larger than what I can pretend to respond to in what I've given. But that's what I do in my class, to think about ways to augment what you consider as the classical, WTO way of teaching. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for all the questions. I'll try to be brief. First, on the processing issue, I think that's something we really see both in Europe and in the US with these two countries through investment facilitation agreement, trying to break the monopoly of China on processing. So we really see, for example, the EU now with all this memorandum of understanding say it's going to be a win-win agreement because you're not going to extract and export to China, but we're going to help you process. It's maybe not going to go further downstream than that, but you're going to do the second step, like this is not done in China, and then you'll export the processed material to the US or to Europe instead. So I think through these investments too, they are trying to break China's dominant position on processing. Yeah, and that's why, in all this agreement, they want to have all the standards on, mining practice and processing practice, which are more friendly than what's done in China. So that's, I think they go in tandem. Then the question from the gentleman at the back, I think your point is very valid. All of this does clash with WTO and go a lot further, but I think that's what the EU wants, right? Because the EU is in this weird position where they have no raw materials, and so we don't have export taxes, we don't have state-owned enterprise that sell, discriminatorily. So we don't care about limiting our policy space on this, but we very much want to limit it for our trading partners, right? Sorry, just making sure I answer all the questions. And then I think Pina, there was two questions from you. The first one was creating common goods and maybe having a more international framework. That was also Gabrielle's point. And I think from an ideal point of view, I think that'd be great. But I think there's so much ground to, bring together because we see the practice are very different, right? The EU is developing new rules in free trade agreements, for example. But China is doing something very different. They're using more corporate model where they use the corporation to invest in other places. And I think all of this plays in this geopolitical context we are discussing is that the EU and the US, their quest for raw materials is not so much about only having access to raw material. It's about cutting off China's dominant position. And so I think having a general agreement would be idealistic. And maybe we could bring I was talking about these two types of tensions between developed and developing countries and between developed countries themselves, including China. And I think we can bridge the gap between developed and developing countries. And we can see it in the negotiation. I mean, the EU concluded chapters on raw materials with Kazakhstan and with Chile, and it gave some exemptions to these countries. I think Kazakhstan, for example, does have an exemption on this import-export monopoly, so they don't have to respect that. So I think this gap is possible to bridge, but bridging the gap between geopolitical competitors is going to be much more difficult. And then on your second point on investment screening, outbound investment screening, I think the EU's policy at the moment is much more carrots than sticks when it comes to mining. So it's a lot of cross-border subsidies given to EU mining companies. So under this memorandum of understanding on raw materials, it's very much like they signed this deal with Kazakhstan, and then the EU promised that it will give financing to EU companies that go mining in Kazakhstan. So they don't go mining somewhere that's theirs friendly. And I think at least for the time being, what the EU is mostly talking about with the outbound investment screening is much more related to technology and not having a technology leakage to China. So yeah, I don't see that very much being used for the time being with raw materials, but that might be quite different with, for example, the US, Canada, and Australia, which have much more mining industries and raw materials.
I'm going to do something abnormal because I had promised I was going to take other questions and we have 10 minutes. So I'll take them right away, those who have some, and continue and go back to them. Yes?
Sylvia Chen for Victor. Continue with similar question on EU's goal of creating by EU and US is breaking up monopoly from China, also setting standards on transparency and environmental standards on mining. And does that bifurcate two sets of supply chains from that so-called responsible, sustainable minerals from the so-called the dirty minerals? And how do you enforce that? How do you enforce the differences from coming into your trading area, for example, EU or the US? And by bifurcating this, you do kind of de-risk on China, but on the other hand, you're creating this decoupling. That's not the goal of an international economic trading system. So how do you resolve that by creating this raw material club?
Are there other questions? So yes, and then that's the last one, and then Victor and the two of you. Go ahead, unless it's distant to me.
Okay. Thank you. This is really a great panel. And Victor, I wanted to probe a little bit because the investment comes with these financing mechanisms. And if you look at I know we've been raising the issue of China, but if I look again at the data most recently, China is investing or providing more loans in Latin America and the Caribbean than the World Bank, IDB, and even Latin American Bank combined. In Africa, you see a similar situation. So they are crowding out, even other sources of investment. And the Americans are now trying to catch up, but they're late in the game. This is a race. And so I want you to give us a perspective as to, that this is impacting on trade, but it's undergirded by finance in the first instance. And so in many respects, China may be so way ahead, having tapped in particularly in the African resources and Latin American resources and Asia, that the others are coming in very, very, EU, United States. in Japan. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I suggest Christian, and then Meredith, and then back to Victor.
Well, thanks for all the great questions. Vera, to your point about Article 24, IPEF, at least the way it was originally imagined, was to have an agreement that was entirely WTO extra. That is the reason why there's no trade liberalization, and by that, for that matter, Article 24 is completely irrelevant to the discussion. That was one of the big aims of trying to bypass it, and also for internal US purposes, which is of course trying to get congressional approval. That's one of the big debates there. And that links quite well to Amy's question there, which concerned the idea of essentially whether IPEF is all that we get, or can we actually use it to build off something else, and to actually address those concerns of the agricultural workers, for instance, or many other sectors. I say there, IPEF is very much a variation on a theme, and that's one of the big points I wanted to draw across. But in doing so, it is very much building on the past experience of the TPP, which led to the alphabet soup of the CPTPP, following the US's withdrawal from that agreement. So what does all this really mean? I'd say it means that IPEF is at least an attempt to address immediate concerns around which all the US, the Democrats and Republicans can gather around, which is largely the China question and largely issues concerning labor, for instance. Whether this can be used to build off something else, I think the question still remains there. It's important to see how the agreements actually come into fruition, what's in the text there, and whether they can get the ball rolling. Because we're not sure whether there's enough carrots to get quite the reward the US is wanting. So that's going to be the question that comes at the end.
Meredith.
Thank you. So Amy, to your question, which was maybe tongue-in-cheek, I was thinking about South Africa and India from the reverse, not so much the JSI proponents going to them and saying what you want, but I was thinking to myself, why are India and South Africa objecting when, to me, that's counterproductive, because it's actually better to have these discussions in the WTO where they can participate and at least hear what's going on and have some input, even if they don't want to join, than have these initiatives pursued externally where you drive traffic out of the WTO, you drive energy out of the WTO, and you have no say. So I was what I settled on was maybe India and South Africa are thinking here, this is going to happen, but let's object and hold it up, both out of principle, but also in hopes that perhaps they could negotiate some sort of something in exchange for, if not formally objecting, if not agreeing, at least not formally objecting. Pinar, to your question, I do think JSIs are a way of experimenting. And I guess a lot of the laboratories, the experimentation that's happened in FTAs has been driven by the developed countries. And then because of the power imbalance, imposing that experiment on their developing country FTA partners who really have no choice but to accept the template or not, right? So I think in the JSI context, at least, even if Turkey maybe stepped out of one, the themes of the ones that have happened thus far, at least, are not really, as Gabrielle said, they're not developed country issues per se, and there's dozens of developing countries participating in them. So I would say it's a different type of experiment, but it seems to be one with a broader appeal than the bilateral, the traditional FTA context.
Victor, do you want to answer? And then.
Well, thank you for the challenging questions. First, Sylvia, to your question on sustainable mining, I think that's quite an interesting point, because what we see is that in the EU FTA, the EU is pushing for quite high standards on mining practice, right? And essentially, you can see that the only companies that can meet these requirements are usually EU or Western mining companies that can mine to such level of environmental friendliness. So in a sense, when countries sign up to this commitment, they say, okay, we'll have to decouple from Chinese mining companies or local mining companies even, because only Western companies can mine to those levels. And then you see it also on the unilateral level, where in a number of unilateral initiatives, the EU is imposing due diligence on its own companies as to where do the raw materials come from? How have they been mined? And that's something we see in the Critical Raw Material Act that's been proposed, the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, I can't remember the exact names, or the conflict mineral. And all of these are used also to ensure that companies move their value chain to countries that mine according to the EU standard, which is usually linked to Western mining companies getting the products off the ground. And then regarding the second question, which was very challenging, I think it's quite interesting because what we really see with this issue is that trade, investment, and finance are all merged together, right? It's not a trade issue or an investment issue, it's all together. And when China started this race for raw materials like 10, 15 years ago, right, which they can do because they don't have the political systems we have. So they could make bets and put a lot of money in financing Chinese companies going abroad, which we can't really do in the West because otherwise voters would be like, why are we investing in this? We don't need it now, right? So China really got ahead of the game through this financing. And we see, as you said, like the EU, maybe not the US, mostly the EU and Japan trying to, the EU now as the global gateway, which is like the equivalent to the Belt and Road Initiative. But in terms of finance, it's much less. And for developing countries, it comes with so many string attached, right? Like that's what, when I talk to people in developing countries, they're like, well, why would we take the EU's money when we have to respect the environment, we have to respect human rights to get 1% of the financing China promises without any condition. And I think the second point is, I think the EU is hoping that all the countries with which it makes deal will move away from China. When you talk to this country, they're like, well, I can work with China and I can work with the EU at the same time, right? So I think what we might see is value chains which start from, well, we don't have the choice, from the Congo, and then split towards one value chain that will go towards China and China's ally, and then another value chain that will go to the West.
Talking about China and Pinar's question, and this sort of funny interaction, investment facilitation was concluded. US was not signatory, but announced they won't block the consensus. And then worried that some would, China called for responsible consensus in WTO. We'll see what it means. Well, I don't know. It means that GSI is very much between developing countries, and it's not just rich and poor, it's complicated. So thank you to amazing panelists.